In 1832, a fur trapper arrived at Fort Union on the upper Missouri River, looking like a man who had crawled out of his own grave. He had been in the Rocky Mountains for 7 years. In that time, Blackfoot warriors had robbed him on 5 separate occasions, taking his pelts, his horses, his rifle, and on more than one occasion, even the clothes off his back. 7 years of wading through ice-cold mountain streams before dawn, skinning beaver in below-freezing temperatures, eating whatever he could catch or scrape off the ground. And after all of it, he had absolutely nothing to show for those 7 years except scars, stories, and the fact that he was still breathing. The painter George Catlin met him there at the fort and wrote down his account because it was too remarkable to let pass without a record. What nobody knew at the time was that this man's experience was not unusual. It was close to the standard outcome for an American fur trapper trying to work in Blackfoot country during the 1830s. The American Fur Company, which was one of the largest commercial operations in the country at the time, was losing somewhere between 15 and 20 men every single year to Blackfoot attacks. Indian agent John Sanford wrote to General William Clark in July of 1833 and made his position clear. The losses did not surprise him at all. As long as white men kept trapping in Blackfoot territory, the killing would continue. Those were not the words of a man guessing. That was a federal official stating what everyone in the fur trade already understood. And yet, every single spring, more young men packed their gear in St. Tand, Louis, loaded onto keelboats heading up the Missouri River, and paddled straight into the most dangerous stretch of wilderness on the continent. The question is not whether they knew the risks. They absolutely did. The question is, what kind of life made those risks feel worth taking? This is the story of what daily life actually looked like for those men. It was 1825, and a fur trader named William Henry Ashley had just changed the entire economics of the beaver trade in western North America. Before Ashley's innovation, trappers had to haul their pelts over 1,000 miles back to St. Louis to sell them. The journey itself could take months, required navigating hostile territory, and cost lives on a regular basis. Ashley came up with something different. He would send supply trains out to a prearranged meeting point somewhere in the mountains, a summer gathering he called a rendezvous, where trappers could trade their beaver pelts on the spot for everything they needed, and then head right back out to the trap lines without ever returning to civilization. The first rendezvous happened near Henry's Fork of the Green River in what is now southwestern Wyoming, and the system caught on fast. Within a few years, hundreds of men were scattered across the Rocky Mountains in small parties of 2, 3, or 4, trapping beaver from the headwaters of the Missouri River down through the Snake River country and into the valleys of present-day Utah, Idaho, and Colorado. These were the mountain men. Washington Irving described them as perhaps the most remarkable class of men on the face of the earth, leading lives of continued exertion, peril, and excitement. Some worked for the big outfits like the Rocky Mountain Fur Company or the American Fur Company. Others were free trappers who answered to nobody, trapped where they pleased, and sold their pelts to the highest bidder at rendezvous each summer. The free trappers had more freedom, but they also carried every ounce of the risk themselves. If a grizzly bear tore up your camp, nobody was sending a replacement. If Blackfoot warriors took your horses and your entire season's catch, the loss was yours alone. The reason anyone accepted that bargain comes down to one article of fashion: beaver felt hats. In London, in Paris, in Prague, you could not participate in polite society without a proper hat on your head, and the finest hat material in the world came from the soft underfur of the North American beaver. The barbs on beaver fur interlock when pressed and heated, creating a dense, waterproof felt that held its shape for years. That single fashion trend, a hat, created a supply chain that stretched from the drawing rooms of Europe all the way to frozen mountain streams in territories that had not even been mapped yet. A dried beaver pelt weighed about 1.5 pounds and sold by the pound for roughly $5 in New York and London markets. That was serious money in the 1820s and 30s. A laborer back east earned maybe $2 for a full day of hard work. A trapper pulling 100 pelts in a season was looking at what felt like a small fortune. But here is the detail that everyone missed at the time. The men doing the actual trapping rarely saw much of that money, because the supply companies at Rendezvous charged markups that would make a modern credit card company blush. Basic goods like flour, coffee, tobacco, gunpowder, and especially whiskey were priced at several times what they cost in St. Louis, and the trappers had no alternative. There were no stores within 1,000 miles. You either paid the markup or you went without. A trapper could spend an entire year in the mountains, pull 100 pelts out of frozen streams, haul them across mountain passes on the back of a mule, and walk away from the rendezvous broke within 3 days of drinking, gambling, and resupplying. By the mid-1830s, the annual rendezvous was attracting up to 500 men, essentially every American trapper and trader working in the Rockies, along with large numbers of Shoshone, Crow, Nez Perce, and other Native Americans who came to trade. It was the social event of the year in a world that had no towns, no churches, no law enforcement, and no contact with the outside world for 11 months at a stretch. Men raced horses, held shooting contests, drank themselves unconscious, and then staggered back into the wilderness to do it all again. For a while, things actually seemed fine. A man could trap all winter, blow his earnings at Rendezvous in July, and head back into the mountains feeling like he had the best job on earth. That did not last. The daily grind of a mountain man started well before the sun came up. A trapper's morning began with whatever food remained from the night before, which often meant a cold strip of dried meat and nothing else. If he was lucky, he had pemmican, a portable mixture of dried meat pounded together with wild berries and rendered animal fat. Pemmican was the original energy bar. It could last for months without spoiling, and it was compact enough to carry in a leather pouch on a long traverse. If he was not lucky, and mountain men were frequently not lucky, breakfast was whatever he could forage or kill before heading to the trap line. They chewed on wild grasses, stripped bark, dug up the roots of prairie potatoes, which tasted something like turnips if you were feeling generous. When game was scarce, they ate their horses, starting with the weakest ones. When horses were gone, they boiled their own moccasins. The leather was already tanned, so cooking it long enough would produce something you could technically chew and swallow. Calling it food was generous, but it kept a man on his feet for another day, and another day was all that mattered. The real delicacy of the mountain man diet was boudins. These were sausages made by stuffing buffalo intestines with wild onions, herbs, and whatever greens were growing nearby. The trapper tied off both ends and roasted the whole thing over an open fire until the casing sizzled and split. Boudins were packed with vitamins and nutrients that straight meat could not provide. The undigested grasses inside the intestinal lining probably helped prevent scurvy, which was a serious risk when your diet was nothing but protein and fat for months at a time. Mountain men genuinely looked forward to making boudins after a buffalo kill. They also ate raw buffalo liver right on the spot, sometimes slicing off pieces while the animal was still warm and the blood was still running. Beaver tail was another prized item, a flat slab of nearly pure fat that could be roasted, fried, or rendered down into oil for cooking and equipment maintenance. The tail fat served double duty as a lubricant for the inner workings of flintlock rifles and the springs of steel beaver traps. Some trappers threw away the rest of the beaver carcass entirely and kept only the pelt and the tail. The meat itself was secondary to the two things that actually had value. After eating whatever passed for breakfast, the trapper headed for the streams. A mountain man typically carried 6 steel traps, each one weighing about 3.5 pounds. The traps were double spring foothold designs, roughly 5 to 6 inches wide with serrated jaws. Setting one meant wading into a mountain stream in water that might be barely above freezing, planting the trap near a beaver lodge or dam or along a slide where beavers entered the water, and driving an iron stake into the stream bed to anchor it. Then came the bait. The trapper smeared a thin layer of castoreum on a willow switch and planted it just above the waterline near the trap. Castoreum was a reddish-brown, oily secretion squeezed from the castor glands of previously killed beavers. Trappers mixed it with pulverized cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves to create a scent that was undetectable to humans in open air, but irresistible to beavers from a remarkable distance. The animals would swim straight toward it and step into the trap. Lines were checked once in the early morning and once at dusk. When a beaver was caught, the trapper waded back in, hauled the animal to shore, and started the skinning process immediately. Preparing a beaver hide was a full procedure. The trapper cut the pelt free, scraped every last bit of flesh and fat from the inside using a specialized knife, and then stretched the cleaned skin on a circular hoop frame made from bent green willow branches. The hides dried on the hoops for several days, depending on weather, and during that time the trapper was still running his other trap lines, resetting bait, hauling dead beavers out of streams, and keeping constant watch for threats. A successful trapper might pull somewhere between 100 and 200 skins in a good season. That was the work of months of cold, wet, exhausting labor done alone or with one or two partners in territory where help was days or weeks away if something went wrong. Which brings us to what the trapper was actually wearing while doing all of this. The iconic buckskin outfit, the one you see in paintings and museum exhibits, was practical. But it was not the romantic, golden-fringed costume of the movies. Real buckskins, made from deer hide that had been tanned with brain matter and smoked over a fire, were stiff, greasy, and permeated with the smell of campfire ash and animal fat. Mountain men sewed their own clothing using strips of sinew as thread and bone awls as needles. When trousers wore through at the knees, which happened constantly, they patched them with whatever scrap of hide was at hand. When a shirt rotted apart, they made a new one from the next deer they killed. Moccasins, the universal footwear, were soft tanned leather that gave excellent ground feel and nearly silent movement, but they offered almost no protection against sharp rocks, cactus thorns, or cold water, and they needed to be replaced every few weeks in rough terrain. Shoes purchased at rendezvous or trading posts had no right or left. Both were cut the same shape, and you wore each one on the same foot day after day until the leather slowly molded to fit. Hygiene was not a concept that applied in any meaningful way. There was no soap in the mountains. There was no toilet paper. There was no change of clothes in the usual sense. A mountain man wore the same set of buckskins for months on end, sweating in them, sleeping in them, skinning animals in them, wiping blood and fat on them. When a creek was nearby and the weather was warm enough to stand the cold, some men stripped down and washed themselves. When it was not, and for most of the trapping season in the high Rockies the water was painfully cold, they simply did not. The grease and smoke embedded in their clothing actually served an accidental purpose. It made the leather more water-resistant and repelled biting insects to some degree. But it also meant that a camp of mountain men could be detected by smell long before anyone came into sight. Contemporary accounts make this clear. These men stank. For shelter, the options ranged from miserable to merely uncomfortable. In mild weather, a trapper slept on the bare ground wrapped in a buffalo robe with his rifle across his chest. In storms, he might throw together a rough lean-to from pine branches and bark. In deep winter, some men dug into snowbanks for insulation, creating crude shelters that trapped body heat but left you buried in a frozen hole until morning. The men who had married Native American women, and a significant number of mountain men did marry into Shoshone, Crow, Flathead, and other tribes, had access to teepees, the cone-shaped portable shelters made from tanned buffalo hides, stretched over long wooden poles. These were warm, weather-tight, and could be assembled or broken down in under an hour. They were by far the best shelter available in the mountains, and the men who had them knew it. Some trappers wintered at the small forts and trading posts scattered across the West, places like Bent's Fort along the Santa Fe Trail or the posts along the Yellowstone River. But even the forts were rough quarters, cramped with dozens of men who had not bathed in months, surrounded by territory where stepping outside the walls at the wrong moment could get you killed. Everything the mountain men had built, the routes, the relationships, the entire economy of the trapline, was about to work against them, because every beaver-rich stream in the Rockies sat in someone else's territory, and the most beaver-rich territory of all belonged to the Blackfoot Confederacy. The Blackfoot Confederacy, which included the Piegan, the Blood, and the Siksika peoples, controlled the northwestern plains and the eastern slopes of the northern Rockies. Their territory stretched across what is now Montana and into southern Alberta, Canada. They were the dominant military power in the region, and they had been fighting American trappers since the Lewis and Clark expedition first passed through in 1806. The conflict started early. One of the first violent encounters between Americans and the Blackfoot happened during the expedition itself, and the relationship never recovered. By the 1820s, trapping in Blackfoot country meant going to war. In August of 1829, the management partners of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company sat down and looked at a map. Most of the beaver streams in the Central Rockies had already been trapped out or were producing diminishing returns. The only major untapped territory left was Blackfoot country. They knew the risks. They went anyway. The company started organizing what they called Blackfoot brigades, parties of up to 70 armed men, large enough that the Blackfoot would think twice before launching a full-scale attack. The American Fur Company entered the same territory in 1830, doubling the number of trappers operating in the contested zone. The Blackfoot did not stop fighting. They adapted. Instead of taking on the large brigades head-on, they ran a relentless guerrilla campaign. They ambushed small parties that separated from the main group. They raided horse herds at night, stranding trappers on foot in the middle of nowhere. They hit men on their trap lines, alone and vulnerable, waist-deep in a stream with a steel trap in their hands and their rifle leaning against a tree 20 feet away. George Catlin, the painter who traveled the upper Missouri in 1832, recorded that the American Fur Company was losing between 15 and 20 men annually to Blackfoot attacks. Indian agent Sanford confirmed those numbers the following year. The man Catlin met at Fort Union, robbed 5 times and stripped of everything he owned, was not telling an unusual story. He was describing the cost of doing business in the wrong neighborhood, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, probably both. There was no law in Blackfoot country, no sheriff, no court, no government authority of any kind to appeal to. The Blackfoot had their own logic for the violence, and it was not irrational. American trappers were extracting resources from Blackfoot land without permission and without paying for the privilege. The weapons that Americans traded to rival tribes like the Crow, the Shoshone, and the Flathead were actively being used against the Blackfoot in ongoing territorial wars. From the Blackfoot perspective, the trappers were trespassers and weapons suppliers to their enemies at the same time. The attacks made strategic sense even if they were devastating to the men on the receiving end. And the Blackfoot were not the only threat on the land. The Rocky Mountains themselves were full of ways to die that had nothing to do with other human beings. Grizzly bears were everywhere in the northern Rockies, and a single encounter with one could end a life in seconds. The most famous case happened in late August of 1823, years before the Blackfoot brigades even started, when a fur trapper named Hugh Glass stumbled onto a mother grizzly with 2 cubs near the forks of the Grand River in present-day South Dakota. Glass fired his single-shot musket but only wounded the animal. Before he could reload, the bear was on him. She slammed him to the ground, ripping open his back, breaking his leg, tearing his throat, shredding him so badly that the men who found him could see bone through the wounds. His companions killed the bear, but Glass was torn apart, and everyone expected him to be dead by morning. The expedition leader ordered 2 men to stay behind and wait for Glass to die, then bury him. One was John Fitzgerald, the other was a teenager named Jim Bridger. They waited a few days. Glass slipped into a coma. Fitzgerald and Bridger took his rifle, his knife, and all his gear, and left to catch up with the main party. They told everyone Glass was dead. He was not. Glass woke up alone in hostile territory with no weapons, no food, no gear, a broken leg, and wounds that were already going septic. He wrapped himself in the bear hide his companions had draped over him as a burial shroud. He set his own broken leg, and he started crawling south toward the Missouri River, over 200 miles away. He ate berries, roots, insects, and the scraps of buffalo carcass that wolves had abandoned. When maggots infested his open wounds, he did not try to remove them. He let them feed, because the larvae were consuming dead tissue that would otherwise rot, turn gangrenous, and kill him. He had no medicine, no bandages, no antiseptic, and no choice. For roughly 6 weeks, Hugh Glass crawled and stumbled through open plains and river breaks, navigating by landmarks like Thunder Butte, When he reached the Cheyenne River, he obtained a crude hide boat, possibly from a band of friendly Lakota, and floated downstream. By mid-October of 1823, Glass limped into Fort Kiowa on the Missouri River. He bought a new rifle on credit and immediately set out to find the men who had left him for dead. He eventually tracked them both down. He forgave the teenager, Bridger. Fitzgerald, he never forgave, but the man had joined the army by then, which put him beyond reach. That story captures something essential about the mountain man world. There was no rescue team, no evacuation helicopter, no hospital. When something went wrong, and something went wrong constantly, you either fixed it yourself with whatever was at hand, or you died on the ground where it happened. Frontier medicine was improvisation under pressure with crude materials and no training. William Bent, who operated Bent's Fort in present-day eastern Colorado, contracted diphtheria sometime in the 1830s. His throat swelled shut so completely that he could not swallow or speak. His Cheyenne wife saved his life by forcing a hollow bird quill down his swollen throat and blowing broth from her own mouth through the quill to feed him. When that was not enough, a Cheyenne medicine man was called. The man examined Bent's throat, then collected small sand burrs covered in tiny sharp barbs, threaded one onto a thin piece of sinew, greased it with marrow fat, and forced it down Bent's throat to scrape open the infected tissue. By modern standards, the procedure sounds closer to torture than medicine. It worked. Bent lived. Even the Rendezvous, the closest thing to a safe gathering in the mountain man world, had its hazards. At the 1833 Rendezvous on the Green River, a rabid wolf, or possibly several rabid wolves, wandered into camp on multiple consecutive nights and bit several men as they slept. The trappers could have shot the animals, but standing camp rules prohibited firing weapons inside the camp perimeter because in the dark, with hundreds of men sleeping on the ground, a stray ball was more likely to kill a trapper than a wolf, so the wolves kept coming back. Charles Larpenteur, who was there, recorded the events in his journal. The men who were bitten had no treatment available. Rabies was a death sentence in the 1830s, and there was nothing anyone could do about it except hope they had not been infected. If you are enjoying this and want more stories like this, hit subscribe. We cover the parts of history that the textbooks skip over. By 1837, the world the mountain men had built was collapsing under its own weight. The beaver populations across the Rockies were nearly destroyed. Streams that had once held hundreds of beaver lodges were empty, trapped out by years of relentless harvesting. At the same time, fashion was shifting across the Atlantic. Silk top hats from China were replacing beaver felt as the mark of a distinguished gentleman in London and Paris. Cheaper furs from South American nutria could produce nearly identical felt for a fraction of the cost. The economics that had sent young men into the mountains, the entire financial engine of the beaver trade, were evaporating season by season. The rendezvous system held on for a few more years, but the enthusiasm was fading. Fewer men attended each summer. Prices for pelts dropped steadily. A depression hit the American economy in 1837, and consumers back east stopped buying luxury goods. The Hudson's Bay Company, operating out of Canada, started sending agents to the American Rendezvous to buy furs at prices the American companies could not match, undercutting the entire system. The 1834 Rendezvous marked the end of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The last official rendezvous took place in 1840 on the Green River. After that, the annual gathering that had been the social and economic center of the mountain man world simply stopped happening. The trappers who showed up that final summer gathered their hangovers, packed what was left of their gear, and scattered. But the mountain men did not disappear. The same skills that had kept them alive in the Rockies, the knowledge of every pass, every water source, every stretch of hostile ground between the Missouri and the Pacific, made them invaluable to the next chapter of American expansion. When wagon trains full of settlers started rolling west toward Oregon, California, and Utah in the 1840s, those families needed guides who knew the territory. Former trappers like Jim Bridger, the same teenager who had once been left behind to bury Hugh Glass, built trading posts along the emigrant trails and hired themselves out to lead families through the same mountains where they had once nearly frozen, starved, and been killed. The paths they had worn as fur trappers became the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail. The routes that had been invisible to everyone except mountain men and the tribes who lived there became highways for 100,000 settlers heading west. That trapper George Catlin met at Fort Union in 1832, the one who had been robbed 5 times in 7 years and walked out of Blackfoot country with nothing but the clothes on his back, and not even those every time, he decided that final robbery was enough. He left the upper Missouri and headed back to civilization. He was not a failure by the standards of his world. He had survived 7 years in Blackfoot country. In the 1830s, when the American Fur Company was burying 15 to 20 of its men per year in that same territory, walking out alive was the accomplishment. Everything else, the pelts, the money, the dream of coming home wealthy, that was just the story men told themselves to keep wading into freezing water before sunrise in country, where the next ridge might hide a grizzly bear or a war party. The real question is not why so many mountain men died out there. The real question is why so many of them kept going back.